Today is April Fool's, and this week on the Bible for Busy People, I'm Jen, by the way, we are talking about odd, unexpected plot twists that happen in certain stories in the Bible. Today we're in Daniel chapter 3. Verse 1 says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. By the way, the Israelites have been exiled to Babylon, and they are under the rule of the Babylonian people. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials, you get it, assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every nation. Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of all of those musical instruments, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. You know, I've been thinking lately a lot about self-denial. Jesus said to be his disciples, we must deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. To me, growing up, self-denial meant making yourself small, sometimes even rejecting aspects of my character that God himself created and put within me and called good. I always felt like I was wrong. And lately, I'm thinking that self-denial actually means keeping us from getting to the point that Nebuchadnezzar does here, keeping us from becoming entitled, from amassing power and praise, and from setting ourselves up as being superior to God and to others. Nebuchadnezzar experiences discipline from God because of this in Daniel chapter 4. So the encouragement here is to be wary of idols and idolaters. Verse 8 says, At this time some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, May the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. Again, the Israelites were in captivity, and they were exiled from their home. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were Babylonian names and chosen by their captors. But their Israelite names were Hananiah, which means Yahweh has been gracious or God has favored, Mishael, whose name means who is what God is, and Azariah, which means Yahweh has helped. And I just want to take a minute to honor that. They were held captive in another country, and their names were changed to fit the culture of the country that was holding them in captivity. What a horrible thing, and how beautiful their names are, their actual Hebrew names. They're even significant to this story that we're telling right now. Continuing on in verse 13, it says, Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of all these musical instruments, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Even if he doesn't, in verse 18. What's your even if he doesn't? This doesn't come from a random decision to be faithful in like some kind of big dramatic moment. This comes from faithfulness in everyday moments. It comes from seeing God work and worshiping Him in those everyday moments. So you are building your faith right now as you listen to this podcast. You are building your faith as you pray to God throughout your day. You are building your faith for the bigger moments where you have to declare your faith. Be encouraged by that. In verse 19, it says, "Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, 'Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?' They replied, 'Certainly, Your Majesty.' He said, 'Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods.' Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, 'Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here.' Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, 'Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and they were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way.'" In verse 25, it says, one of them looked like a son of the gods. Jesus was in the fire with them. Doesn't that blow you away? How does Jesus show up in the fire with you? And then verse 27 is something I struggle to wrap my mind around, because if I'm near a fire for even a few minutes, all my clothes and even my hair and sometimes my skin smell smoky. But they were in a blazing hot furnace that killed the people who threw them in, and they came out cool and smoke-free. Lastly, imagine the impact they made on the culture around them, one that was so willing to adopt Nebuchadnezzar as a god and worship him. I hope you remember today that Jesus is in the fires of your biggest trials. I hope you remember those suffering throughout the world for the word of God, and that it can embolden you to stand firm. No matter what God does, you can obey. Thanks for talking with me, and we'll chat tomorrow about another story with a plot twist.